This is the CitizenLink Report.
If you find our insights helpful, would you support our video efforts? Your gift of $25 or more goes a long ways. Covers the crew, lights, cameras, all that. Just click on Donate. Thanks from all of us. Even if you're a news-savvy person, it was hard to discern the truth last week. The mainstream media flagrantly maligned an otherwise fairly ordinary bill in Arizona. How does a thoughtful Christian sort through a nationwide smokescreen? This is the CitizenLink Report. Hi, I'm Stuart Shepard along with Bruce Houseknecht, who follows the courts for Focus on the Family. Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Stuart.
This was an interesting story because if someone was to just go by NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, the Associated Press, the New York Times News Service, they would have had a very different view of a bill that was being considered in Arizona than what was actually being talked about there by lawmakers. Tell us about it.
That's right. SB 1062 in Arizona was simply some technical amendments to their Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It's a general religious freedom bill. It's been around for 20 years, even at the federal level. But the first headlines that came out about this bill last week was that it was anti-gay. And once those headlines came out, it just basically ballooned, and it became not a religious freedom bill. It became an anti-gay bill.
Before I knew anything about the specifics of the bill, that was the first thing I heard. This is a refusal of services bill. I thought, well, that's the end of that. This thing's going to go down pretty quickly. And that was exactly the intent of those news outlets.
Oh, yes. And by misrepresenting what the bill actually did, it caused millions of people not to read the bill, not to understand the nuances of what was actually happening.
Including people in the news business who clearly did not read the language of the bill.
Yes. There were very few that actually got it right. I was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, and their reporter was very good about asking the right questions about what this really meant. But they were an exception in the midst of a tidal wave of misrepresentation by the media.
The closest I saw in other news outlets would be Reuters, which said it was a bill dubbed anti-gay, and it described in the early paragraphs that critics call it anti-gay, but you had to go 13 paragraphs in before you really got a sense of what it was about, because it was all the talking points from one side of the issue. That's not how journalism is supposed to be done.
Well, the other thing I noticed was the initial headlines were all Governor Brewer considers controversial anti-gay bill. Governor Brewer vetoes controversial anti-gay bill. And then the day afterwards, there were some news outlets going, I wonder how that bill got to be so controversial. And so they actually explored in depth what people on our side of the issue were actually saying.
Which would have been helpful to do before the bill went through all that process. Before we get on with how this happens, how even local news outlets get this messaging completely from one side of the issue, why is it that the activists on the other side of this went nuclear on this particular thing? And why did all the mainstream news outlets, those major news sources that try to be the source you can trust, why did they go nuclear on this rather arcane bill that would have just said, if you're a business, you'll be considered as a person in the eyes of the law?
I think it's because we've reached a new stage in the debate of homosexuality and religious freedom. They've always clashed in the marketplace. And now the gay activist organizations have found a real good talking point that these religious freedom bills are all anti-gay. So the newspapers just pick that up and they run with it without really exercising any true journalistic expertise to figure out what's going on.
And it should be pointed out, the federal version of this was brought up by none other than Chuck Schumer, who is not exactly a conservative by any stretch of the imagination, and signed into law by
President Bill Clinton in 1993.
Also not a conservative.
Not a conservative. It was passed unanimously in the House of Representatives and 97-3 in the Senate. It was backed by the ACLU and People for the American Way and every liberal organization that was out there, plus all the conservative organizations that were out there. Everyone at the time wanted to restore the religious freedom that was guaranteed under the First Amendment that had been tarnished by a specific Supreme Court decision in 1990. So everybody loved it.
And no one will be more surprised to find out they're anti-gay than Chuck Schumer and Bill Clinton. I mean, it's going to be a shock to them to find that out. Yeah. Let's talk about how this happens. The mainstream media essentially took the talking points from the other side of this issue and made them the main points in every story. Let me give you a couple examples, though, of how that shows up in your news feed where you're watching at home. home. Here's one example. You think you're getting the news from a local news outlet. Here's from News Channel 5 in Louisiana. But see those two letters in parentheses at the top there? This is an Associated Press story that got passed through by the local station to its website. Same thing can happen in the TV news. They'll take the copy from the Associated Press. If you're in the news business, this is a reliable source. This is what the story is about in your eyes as a news person. If you don't have time, which often happens in local news, to go look it up yourself, well, this becomes then what it is. So then it gets read on the air. I was listening to the Rush Limbaugh program on a major radio station here in Colorado, and they tend to have conservative talkers all day long. In the news break, the local news break, they came up with the language from the other side as Rush was explaining what this was really all about on either side of that news break. So they weren't even paying attention to their own programming that day. Here's another one. This is the site for the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. But notice this story is actually from the New York Times news service. Another one that gets passed through on the website. You see it on your local news. You think, oh, well, they're reliable. They're trustworthy. We like our local news people. And to give you an idea where the New York Times is coming from, Bruce, I want to get your opinion on this. Here's an editorial that was published with the loaded headline, "A License to Discriminate." It sounds like a James Bond film or something. Here's what they wrote. There are 17 states where it is legal for same-sex couples to marry, and there is no evidence that the accelerating progress toward equality, their language, not mine, has compromised anyone's freedom to worship or hold religious beliefs. Bruce?
Well, we've seen example after example of how that isn't true. I could start at Ocean Grove Camp Meeting Association in New Jersey, who had it basically is a church that had part of their tax exemption revoked by the state of New Jersey for refusing to allow a facility of theirs to be used for same-sex celebration of a commitment ceremony. You have the wedding photographers in Albuquerque, New Mexico, who were fined $6,600 because they've politely declined to photograph a lesbian commitment ceremony. You have bakers and florists in Oregon and Washington and here in Colorado who are facing civil rights commissions, human rights commissions, and fines and possibly losing their business if they're forced with the choice of violating their conscience or complying with these laws that infringe their freedom of religion.
And the New York Times looks at all that because they run stories, I think, on most all of those and say there is no evidence that it's compromised anyone's freedom to worship or hold religious beliefs.
That's just not true.
Well, the way they phrase it is the freedom to worship inside your church. Oh, that's just fine. And hold religious beliefs. We can hold those beliefs. You just can't actually live those beliefs, I think, is what they're trying to leave out of that paragraph to make it true.
And we've seen that even from this administration over the last several years. Instead of freedom of religion in every public declaration of holidays and things like that, we've been hearing the phrase freedom of worship. And social conservatives have been decrying that ever since and saying, look, First Amendment doesn't talk about freedom of worship. It talks about freedom of the free exercise of religion, and that includes everything. In addition to what you do on Sunday in your church, it includes walking that out in your daily life.
And then here's the second paragraph in that editorial. Unfortunately, that lack of evidence has not stopped religious and social conservatives from pressing lawmakers in various states to enact noxious measures to give businesses and individuals the broad right to deny services to same-sex couples in the name of protecting religious liberty. Bruce, what do you say about that?
It's funny how you can make the First Amendment sound like an anti-freedom amendment. It's just amazing because these statutes are really based on the First Amendment. And the freedom of conscience, the freedom of the right to free exercise of religion is all based on what the founders thought was the underpinnings of our nation. And that is the right to seek God, the right to walk out your beliefs on a daily basis in everything you do, for whether it's in the four walls of your church or in your business or in your relationship to your countrymen.
Now, this is part of a progression. I remember when I got here in 1999 and first started dealing with these issues on the radio, we were at that time talking about domestic partnerships. We need domestic partnerships recognition in law. Oh, no, that's not enough. Civil unions came up next. Remember that? Civil unions, we need to have civil unions recognized in law. Not marriage. Oh, no, we're not asking for marriage. This is just a civil union. The arguments were made in front of state legislatures around the country. But guess what? Civil unions weren't enough. We need marriage. We need to redefine the institution of that's the bedrock foundation of family and social structure for eons, we're going to redefine that because that's what we really need. Now it's redefined in many states. Guess what? That's not enough either, because the message now is if you will not celebrate a same-sex ceremony, you will be punished. You will be taken to court, you'll be taken to a civil rights commission, you'll be put out of business if they can do that, you'll be fined, you may go to jail.
Yeah, as one commentator puts it over and over again, and I think he's right, you will be made to care. And frankly, what the final resolution or what the gay activist organizations are really after is the coerced acceptance of all of their actions, behaviors, and whatnot, and at the risk of penalties, fines, jail time in some cases if you fail. And so that's the direction the country's headed. It's a sad story to actually have to tell people.
And the underlying dynamic here, and I've been to gay activist conferences, I've interviewed them on the street, here's what it comes down to. They sincerely believe that, while they know that they're feeling pain, they hurt, but they sincerely believe that it can't be because of anything they're doing, because their argument would be, I was born this way, this is how I was created, therefore. So then that pain they're feeling must be coming from you, the Christian, anyone who speaks out against what it is that they're arguing for in culture. So the goal of all of this is to get every Christian to stop talking about it, to use the force of law to change what's taught in schools, to raise children differently so that they have different attitudes about it. But the Scripture doesn't change.
No. And Christians, the issue isn't how Christians should treat homosexuals. There's a variety of thought on that, and people who own a wedding photography business might pick one route and another might pick another route. The real question here is whether the government should be coercing us to choose one way or the other. That's the entire issue we're talking about.
Bruce, thanks for your insights. Appreciate your coming by today.
You're welcome.
And thank you for watching. You may always write to us at mail@citizenlink.com. We're open to your comments and your criticisms. Remember to pray for state legislators around the country who are trying to navigate this difficult terrain. Pray that they'll have wisdom and insight. Pray for the governors who sign or do not sign these bills, that they would have courage in the midst of this onslaught from the other side of false information, of misleading and maligning descriptions of what these things are really all about. Pray for our religious freedom in this country, that we may continue to preach the gospel, to share the good news of Jesus Christ as we see it in the Bible. Now remember, stand tall and be heard.